You're listening to Out of the Box, a place for marketers to get inspired, get going, and break out of the box.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, I'm joined by Sviat, founder at Applica Agency, a mobile app growth agency focused on monetization and activation. Sviat, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me here, Jess.
So, we're going to talk today, I think, a lot about business models, right? Specifically around subscription apps, and I really want to get into the nitty-gritty, get some of your experience, get some of your insights. I always like to start with getting to know who I'm talking to. So tell me a little bit about your journey in marketing and your experience with subscription apps across your career.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the story would go a little bit deep into the past. Initially, I was very curious in social sciences and behavioral sciences, and particularly I studied behavioral economics. And at some point, I felt, there's a lot of theoretical knowledge about the human beings, the decision-making process, And at some point, I felt, wow, there should be some kind of practical application of that. And probably the best field to go for those experiments, and being able to actually run all of these hypotheses and test the theories is the world of technologies. And specifically, at that point, I studied at Harvard University, and originally I'm from Ukraine, and we have one very famous Ukrainian health and fitness startup, Better Me. So I just applied. That was my kind of first job. I applied for the position of the performance marketing specialist, and I was very curious to start all of this experimentation. And I spent the first 6 months of my career working with the user acquisition, creatives production, all of these things. And then at some point, of course, the speed of testing is, of course, huge in the world of performance marketing, and you have some robust results. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper and started touching some deeper parts of the funnel, such as monetization and activation. So going just beyond acquisition. And that's where things started going interesting. So it feels like, we can of course return to that when we will be discussing the difference between some mobile companies from the West and the Eastern Europe. But eventually, I just had this experience working for Ukrainian startup. And then at some point, I started consulting other companies from the West, and I noticed all of these big difference in terms of methodology and approaches and focus on particular parts of the funnel, etc. So I had some great clients, and then at some point I decided, well, it's probably time to just scale this personal expertise, and find some like-minded product managers and scale it to the agency. And that's how Applica was created. And now we mostly work with subscription apps, and we help them boost revenue through the optimizations of pricing, onboardings, paywalls, push notifications, some retention mechanisms as well, and adding on top of that paid user acquisition. So it becomes kind of a smooth transition from acquisition to all of these deeper parts of the funnel. Yeah, that's very short backstory.
Very cool. Well, I mean, there's a lot to dive into there, but I want to specifically pick up on your experience in comparing work methodologies or testing methodologies between the East and the West. I think that's a super interesting point. Can you dive in a little bit more to what those differences were?
Yeah, for sure. That's kind of a big topic. So feel free to stop me if you get bored at some point. Well, I think most of the listeners, of course, know how the startups from the United States or Western Europe approach growth. And the fundamental difference here compared to the Eastern Europe and countries like Ukraine, Belarus, is that there is an access to venture capital in the West, and that makes just a tremendous difference because here in Ukraine, for example, in order for you to have a successful startup, you have to build profitable user economics, just from the first days of the launch. So there is no time for branding, too much of optimization of some core product functionality. Basically, what people do here is try to build a working MVP that would have some, of course, product market fit, and then focus probably 70-80% of their attention to building the strong unit economics. And that's, I think, the kind of experience I've got as well by when working for Ukrainian startups. It seems that we spent like also 60-70% of the time on this kind of optimization of paywalls, pricing, activation. And when I joined some of the Western companies as a consultant or advisor, I saw that the focus was mostly on things like product engagement and retention, and that's quite different. And especially these differences, of course, are visible in the world of subscription apps that are content driven. They are naturally inclined to have lower retention rates compared to SaaS products, let's say, or social media, of course, or some entertainment products. And that is probably one of the most fundamental difference here. So basically, by this limitation of not being able to raise some venture capital, and it's not impossible, it's way harder to do that. Companies from Eastern Europe have to focus on building this strong user economics. Yeah.
Do you think that there's an advantage to building or focusing more on strong user economics earlier as opposed to taking the quote unquote a longer route?
Well, there are both advantages and disadvantages, and let's stop here for a while. So first one, I think in this case, there is higher likelihood that you can build a fully bootstrapped company and you keep the independence, and that's just great, for sure. Of course, you lower your margin of profits, because in this case, it also means that you have to be mostly driven by performance marketing instead of some, organic growth. And then you have just huge expenditures on performance marketing as well.
Right.
One more risk, I think, is that sometimes you might have a product that hasn't really reached this product market fit stage, and you will be just having too high of a churn at some point, and that will become a limitation. But I think it just how it historically evolved here, that there was no other probably way to build a successful startup. And if that's interesting, because if you would ask me what's the most optimal way to build a subscription app, there is no single answer. If you would look at some top grossing charts, and check how many apps, let's say within health and fitness industry or education, how many apps started initially with the approach of optimization of retention, or actually the second variant when they started with the optimization of monetization. I think the split will be like 50-50, honestly.
I want to take you into a little bit about the technicality of actually identifying the difference between a product focused versus a monetization focused app, because I don't think I would be able to tell the difference looking at the top charts. How do you tell the difference between the two?
Well, that's a great question, because usually that's a knowledge that I acquired historically by just looking how some products evolved, and in some of the most famous niches, like let's say dating, health and fitness, meditation, um, education. I've been tracking the whole industry for the last 3 or 4 years, and more or less know what kind of A/B tests all of these top grossing products has. Well, sometimes it's not that obvious. Of course, might be some rules of thumb, like you can work, you can just look at the country of origin of the app and check whether this particular company has raised any VC capital. And if it's not the case, then most likely there is no other way how they could get to the top charts if they haven't optimized the monetization part of the app strongly, right? The second one is to use some tools that can, with some level of confidence, most often it's not that, of course, precise, to predict the average revenue per user or even revenue per download. And that can indicate whether the app is driving some paid user acquisition, or just relying on some organic traffic. And probably the more the share of paid user acquisition is, the most likely the app had to build a strong unit economics and monetization within to be able to compete on the auction, right? In Facebook or Google Ads, etc.
Right.
But yeah, one more thing is to just start tracking some of the best performing apps and trying to spot any kind of difference over time when it comes to their paywalls and pricing, because the first things usually apps optimize are there on the surface, like the frequency of paywalls shown, the pricing for their subscriptions, the duration of their subscriptions, and that can have, of course, some tremendous impact on the final revenue metrics. Yeah, that's probably how I would approach that if I would start from scratch.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to see if I can follow along and try and tell the difference between the top 5 or 10 apps, and I'll have to compare notes with you. If you're looking at sort of coming into the subscription space, and you're looking at implementing a new subscription strategy, what would you do if you're in the shoes today of a developer who wants to implement a subscription? What are the steps that you take to make it a success?
Well, that's just a great question, because that's often what my clients ask me, when especially young startups. The first question, how they can approach monetization overall. And the easiest thing to do is actually take, let's say, top 3 5 of your competitors, and especially those that relied on this business model of monetization optimization. So quite often they might have slightly less developed core product functionality, which might result in let's say lower app ratings sometimes it might result in lower retention. But imagine if they manage to climb to the top of the ladder, most likely, and it happens so with not a really great product, and there are examples like that, a lot of them. Most likely they build something outstanding in terms of user acquisition, marketing, and monetization, and that's where you can draw some inspiration. So that would be just very simple thing to do, I would assume.
And when you're actually implementing a strategy, or implementing maybe a test even, what are the things that you're doing to actually, to get it done correctly and effectively, and to understand whether it was a success or not? So, are there specific frameworks that you use? How do you allocate budgets or levels of traffic? What are the KPIs you're looking at?
Well, I think it's important to mention that the frameworks would change as your product evolves, and basically the frameworks that work for the products that acquire just 5,000 users per day is different than for the product that acquires 100,000 users per day. For example, I think if you cannot complete an A/B test within a period of 1-2 weeks, it's better just to roll out historical changes and aim for some hypotheses that are quite distinct from the control version. And in this case, of course, it's not that perfect ideal A/B test environment where you can say for sure that you achieved some improvements, but that should be enough for you to see the impact on your metric, even if you compare some historical results. Of course, taking into account that the acquisition sources and audience quality hasn't changed much over this period of time. But you would just save time, on collecting a huge sample size if you cannot afford that. Then when we move on and the subscription app has some greater level of maturity and can acquire more users, either organically or via paid traffic, of course, there is some point when you have to implement the basic A/B testing frameworks. And once again, over the time, I've collected my list of hypotheses that should be tested first, and then that usually might have the biggest impact. Because imagine there are myriads of possibilities what you can test. You can test, of course, people back then. Uh, Loved when someone wanted to test the color of the button or something like that. And of course, we know that most likely it will not bring any substantial change. Yes, but there are also other things that are not that intuitive, and maybe it's worth just saving time on not testing this particular thing at all and focus on something different.
So you talked a little bit about the frameworks changing over the course of the lifetime of an app, and that I can certainly understand. Do you think that there's also different levels of aggressivity with your monetization approach in a subscription model that can change over the course of time? How should developers be looking at their how aggressive their monetization is? I guess that's my question.
Yeah. Well, let me be blunt here. I think that once when you start, and especially when you bootstrap your app, and if you want to, of course, run some paid acquisition and be able to compete on the ad auctions, you actually have to be a little bit aggressive. Otherwise, if you're just too generous, you give out an access to your features for free. There is no point. You don't show paywalls frequently. You'll just not be able to collect money from the users who would actually be very happy to pay for your product. You just don't show them the opportunity to spend the money in your product. And ideally, I think a rule of thumb is probably to start with I wouldn't call it aggressive, because aggressivity has some negative connotation as a word, right? But it's more about probably the frequency of interactions with some monetization stuff in your app. And let's actually take a very specific example. Let's say there is a subscription app, and what's, of course, the usual practice that, let's say, you have a long onboarding, you ask some personalized questions, you ask about the user's age, name, some other characteristics, and then at some point after that you show the paywall. And that's, of course, it's a very standard practice, everyone does. But one particular thing that I witnessed and tested many times, and that worked particularly well, if we would start to add in one more paywall just after the first initial login or sign up, that would briefly state all of the benefits of the product without even showing that. And of course, someone might perceive that as a little bit shady practice, right? So you just ask for money without even showing any kind of core product functionality. And you're right, but there are other apps on the market that do that quite successfully. And of course, imagine that the user might be already quite well informed about your app on the early stages. Like you're already showing some bit of your product in the video or image somewhere on Facebook. Then there was an interaction with your App Store page with screenshots, description. So then that's, of course, the first interaction with the monetization. But you can already convert someone and have some trust, in advance, and the user might be willing to actually spend money on subscription. And you create, of course, some high expectations, but then there is good incentive for you to have a good product inside to deliver on those expectations. Yes. So, and then the question, like one more thing that's probably worth doing is actually showing the paywall on each app launch. Let's say the user just, there is a new day, he opens your app, of course, he wants to use its functionality, but if he opens your app and you know, that's a good sign that he's interested, you might show him like the paywall just right ahead and explain that there is some premium functionality behind that he's missing, and that's a good interaction. But so by just doing these two simple interventions, I think the app founders and product managers can substantially grow the average revenue per user, without risking much of being too irritative.
So the showing the paywall on app launch, I think certainly is pretty easy to implement, and it definitely makes sense to me. It feels to me like the your first suggestion is possibly a little bit more complicated, right? Which is sort of connecting your UA to your monetization. And we've talked with a couple of other guests on the podcast in previous episodes about the need for cross-functional teams, right? And this speaks to that idea, which is connecting both your UA teams with your monetization teams to make sure that the it's the same language being spoken and there's sort of a fluid handoff. Can you speak a little bit about how you see that working?
For sure, I think that's extremely important topic, especially when it comes to this kind of new functionality of custom product pages. So of course, most of the products have multiple use cases, and then you want to show a particular use case with a particular marketing message with a particular image, and then lead the user to the specific custom product page that highlights this specific use case. And ideally, if it's possible, you also want the user to um, continue into this funnel of this specific use case once he actually installs your app as well, right? So I think what's really missing in a lot of teams that I just had a chance to communicate with, that their marketing team works separately from ASO team and works separately from the product team. And of course, they have some kind of formal sync meetings once per week. Uh, but ideally, I think there'll be a huge benefit if they could design these cross-functional teams, where people would just be working together and making sure that there is this smooth transition from the acquisition part to the app store page part to the actual product onboarding and activation part of the funnel.
Yeah, I guess that's one of those challenges that's maybe easier said than done, right? Getting that work done and everybody working together and running at the same speed.
For sure.
We've talked a lot about the sort of hardcore mechanics of the paywall, where it is, how often it should be shown. I want to sort of switch gears into the actual content of the paywall. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you've seen or what you've developed as best practices for things like pricing or design of the actual paywall?
Yeah, sure. So basically, let's take just a very basic paywall. So what kind of elements we have there, right? We have the price, but before price, we also have the subscription products. Like some of the apps offer just one product on one paywall. Usually, it's like yearly subscription, for example. Some apps rely on comparing two prices, like here is short-term, let's say weekly or monthly subscription compared to yearly subscription, and usually, yearly subscription, of course, looks better and discounted. And then some apps go crazy with like three or four products, and sometimes three products, for example, work great as well. So that's the first variable we have here, right? The second one is, of course, overall design and copy. And let's say, do you want to highlight the difference between free and premium functionality? Or do you want to highlight, for example, how your free trial works, as a famous example of Blinkist Paywall, right? That just became extremely popular. Or, there are other, for example, some of the fitness apps are using video paywalls when they just show, let's say, how people exercise using their app on the background of the paywall, and that can be quite effective as well. And that's one more variable to test. Yeah, the next one is whether you have a free trial or not, and how long is your free trial? Is it 3, 7 days, 14 days? Then we have a copy on the call to action button. Sometimes things that goes overlooked, but honestly, I found that even with the very optimized onboarding funnels and monetization, some of the apps could just simply add 10 to 15% to their RPU by just testing this copy on the call to action button. And usually it starts with something simple like continue, or purchase, to something more sophisticated like try try this app for free for the next 7 days if it highlights the free trial. And there are some best practices how to approach that, and imagine, like, for the new app, for the app founder or product manager who would like to actually start testing all of these variables. The first question is, where should I start? It just, it's a lot of testing I have to do.
Interesting. So from what I understand, there's a lot that can be tested in terms of actually, what sorts of features to highlight, or button text, or how the copy should actually be written. And I'm wondering whether a hybrid model between, sort of all of these things you're talking about, 2 prices or 3 prices, free trial or no free trial, is that something that you test within user segments, or do you usually think that that's something that should be pretty standard across the board, and it's really fine tuning the wording of the offer? Should the offer change as well as how it's presented?
Well, first of all, there is no real possibility, and that's often um, is limited, by the policies of Google and Apple, and you have to basically show the same paywall for everyone. You cannot really segment the audience here, right? But yes, when basically for the new app that's just starting, probably it wouldn't make sense to test micro improvements and just changing the copy, but ideally is to take 2 or 3 examples of the best paywalls. Let's say a standard Blinkist paywall compared to the paywall of Flow app that has this free trial toggler, the famous one as well, and compared to some other third paywall, let's say with 3 subscription tiers, and try to measure the RPU of these 3 options over time in your particular case. And that comes to this kind of macro level improvement. But when we go further, and of course some apps are already optimized and they have chosen kind of their path, in terms of paywalls. So they found, for example, that showing the information about free trial works best in their case. The next thing is just the simplest one, as I mentioned already, is to just increase the frequency of the paywall shown and the placements of the paywall, right? Once you do that, it's probably most likely to see the biggest benefits if you move to the pricing. And there are some sweet points in pricing, like, let's say, $50 per year, $60 per year, and quite often $90 per year. As let's say we had an app where we tested every pricing option for yearly subscriptions, starting from $39 up to 110, and just then repeated the test with a few other apps. And these three particular pricing tiers were showing the greatest results. So I would allow you just maybe to skip this step, and it's a very boring test, honestly, very technical one, right? You just can test this for a couple of months, even half a year, but eventually you would love to know your pricing elasticity. And then, of course, that can be also changed based on the location. In the United States, you can charge more. When it
Right.
comes to some second tier countries, you want to charge less. We will not talk about that right now because it will just go to the abyss with this topic. Um, yeah, and then basically price would be the third point of optimization, and the fourth one is about the copy and the call to action button. And I think for someone who's used to test more interesting things like new product functionality, new features inside the app, this can sound a little bit boring, and it is boring, honestly, quite often, right? Because it's playing with numbers, with math, trying to be as precise as possible in calculations of the lifetime value or average revenue per user. But that's what differentiates apps with strong unit economics at the end of the day, right? They've invested their time, resources, teams, their attention to these things, and it paid them back. And they've seen some great returns on these investments.
Wow, Sviat, I think that's a very interesting place to wrap up our conversation. I think that you've given us a lot of food for thought. Placement of the paywall, the actual pricing you're using, the design, the copy. You've given us a lot of information, and hopefully a lot of actionable insight that our listeners can take forward and implement within their apps. I want to finish by asking you to share what your most seemingly simple on the surface, but actually quite impactful best practice is. Can you share us a little bit of your best secret?
One recommendation would be just to switch to the thing that would allow just to actually increase the speed of experimentation, and save the time on engineering. And that's basically where you put all of your paywalls and onboarding screens, and make them as remote configs. And it's usually performed via Firebase. And by doing that, you just save a lot of time in the future and offload your developers. And basically, with a little bit of the knowledge of the JSON files, you can launch the test remotely, even without releasing a new version of the app. And I think that if you are not doing that, that's something you should start to do quite soon.
That's a great tip. I think that's really actionable, and that's certainly something that I don't think we would have gotten from anybody else but you. Sviatoslav, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.